Sony A7 III 120 frames per second. Is it any good? Is it usable? Welcome back, friends. David Lee back, brand new video. Today we're talking about exactly what I just said, right? Is the Sony A7 III and the 120 frames per second any good, right? Could you rely on it to be used on a commercial shoot or on a client shoot, right? Where someone's paying you money, basically, at the end of the day. Now, depending on what you shoot, sometimes you might need high frame rate a lot of the time, right? So for anyone who does a lot of action stuff, high speed action, could be like sports, gymnastics, anything in that realm. Maybe it's food, right? Maybe you do a lot of like liquid type commercials or food commercials where stuff's pouring, stuff's flying this way, right? And you might need 120 frames per second to capture it, to help tell that story, to help create your ad campaign or whatever it is, right? But sometimes the 120 frames per second out of these like smaller cameras, right? Mirrorless cameras or DSLRs, just isn't up to par, just isn't that good. Now, I've used 120 frames per second on multiple cameras, and for certain cameras, the 120 frames per second is really good. On other cameras, it's not so good, right? So like take for instance, the GH5, which I used to have. I never used anything past the 60 frames per second, the 10-bit 422, as anytime I went up to the high frame rate, the variable frame rate as it's called, it just like, it was, not only was it 8-bit 420, it just looked like super digital, you know, to a point where it looked almost like something I would use on my iPhone. I would have to use a lot of post-production, a lot of sharpening, a lot of grain, a lot of denoising, and it just wasn't something that I wanted to do. Not something I wanted to deal with all the time. And then you have cameras like, say, the 1DX Mark II, the 120 frames per second was really good. Even though it was 8-bit 420, it was at a higher bit rate, right? It's around 150 megabits per second. And it's full frame, right? So it's a faster readout. And cameras like that, even though they're, you know, smaller, so to say, they're very, they can compete very well with the other cameras. So if you are in the market for a camera that can do 120 frames per second, that's very small, you have a lot of options, especially now, right? Canon EOS R6, again, very like affordable camera. The A7S Mark III might be a little bit out of your range, but still pretty affordable compared to like a Red or an Arri. Or any other camera that costs more than like $2,000. You have the Sony A7 III, right, which we have right here today. Is it good? Is it usable? Is it something that you can rely on? And the short answer is yes. The 120 frames per second is actually pretty good, even though it's 8-bit 420. You can get 100 megabits per second out of it, but I feel like there's certain things under the hood of the A7 III that are helping the 120 frames per second to be much better. Say compared to like 3 years ago when I was using the A6500, the 120 frames per second just wasn't good. You know, even if you were not using S&Q, it was just super compressed, super heavily. It just looked like muddy. You know, I didn't want to use it, so I ended up just using the 60 frames per second more often than not. Comparing it to, like, say, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, the 120 frames per second out of that camera is super good, right? You have Blackmagic RAW, you have ProRes 422 HQ if you need it, and I never noticed any quality difference, even though you need to like crop in on the sensor. But now let's take a look at some footage shot with the A7 III in 120 frames per second. Something that you guys might use, right? Say it's a food type thing, right? So it might be coffee, might be liquid, it might be actual like a barbecue or something like that. Let's take a look at what this camera, what the 120 frames per second looks like. Now, the one feature that Sony has had for quite some time, for many, many years, is this slow and quick feature of their cameras, right? They have it in like the FS line, they have it in their higher-end cameras, they have it in their mirrorless cameras. And you know, again, 3 years ago, using the A6500, it just wasn't any good, right? What it does is it basically conforms the footage in camera, so you don't have to do it in your NLE, right? In Resolve or in Premiere or in Final Cut Pro 10, right? It just does it in camera. But what it does, at least with like the Sony Alpha line, is it compresses the living daylights out of the camera, right? Or out of the codec, down to like 12 megabits per second, 15 megabits per second, something that you just really don't want to use. And when you use S&Q, slow and quick, you don't get audio recorded. So what I found out when using the A6500 was, you know, to not use S&Q, but to just go into the camera settings and change the recording format to 120 frames per second, and you get 100 megabits per second, right? And the same thing with the A7 Mark III is they have that same feature. Again, the S&Q, you don't get audio when you record, so that's a bummer. And it doesn't take a lot to just conform your footage in post, right? It takes a couple of seconds, so it's not a huge deal. And if I can get a higher bit rate while the recording, then I will want to opt for that always. Final thoughts? Pretty good. I mean, not bad, right? I didn't have any issues with the 120 frames per second, and pretty heavy color grading too. You can use LUTs or you can use hand color grading techniques, right? But I mean, for me, my regular, the way that I regularly grade footage, it held up really, really well. Again, it's 8-bit 420, but if you have good lighting, if you have very characterized lenses, right? You have like sharp lenses, you have lenses that can add to your image, then the 120 frames per second is extremely useful, right? And it's very, very usable. Keyword is usable. If I wanted to use this for a client shoot, no problems at all. You know, if I wanted to use this on a gimbal, on a car rig, if I just wanted to go, you know, handheld or on a slider, capturing food or liquid, like it's good, right? It's not, I mean, it's not like crazy insane good, but I mean, it's good enough where you would have no issues color grading it and manipulating the footage in post. It's a good 120 frames per second. That being said, friends, if you liked the video, leave a thumbs up. I would appreciate it. Leave a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts on the 120 frames per second and the A7 III. Subscribe to my YouTube channel as always, just so you're notified of new content coming out. Hit that bell notification so you guys know exactly when the next video is out. And remember, friends, every day you have an opportunity to create your experience and to write and tell your own story. My name is David Lee, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. I got car payment to come in, I got the house to pay. You know, so you're kind of in this very like self-doubting moment. Let's get you over here, Amanda. So right about this like step over here.